The Malik mansion stood at the edge of the city like a promise and a warning at once. Glass and marble shining in the sun, gates high and watchful, gardens kept with the kind of precision no one had time for unless they had someone to impress. People whispered the name Zayn Malik with half reverence, half fear. He had built an empire from nothing, factories humming at dawn, contracts signed in 5 languages, a face on magazine covers. He moved through the city with a comfortable, dangerous calm. He had money, power, respect, and a hollow that nobody guessed at. Era came from a small house in a neighborhood where neighbors left doors open and teacups were never empty. Her world had been simple, a mother who hummed old songs while kneading dough, a father who taught her how to count money and keep promises, and a sister, Hania, who teased and steadied her in equal measure. Era's dreams were small and honest. She wanted to keep a home warm, plant roses by a window, cook a meal that would make someone sigh. She wanted the ordinary kindnesses that make life feel safe, a hand to hold, a voice that says I see you. When the match was proposed, her parents cried for joy and worry at once. Zayn Malik's family called, arranged a meeting, and within weeks the city talked about the wedding as if it were inevitable. Era wore her mother's old jewelry on the morning she left, a simple gold bangle that had lost some of its shine but held the warm weight of generations. Her mother pressed it on her wrist and said, "Beta, take care of yourself. Allah is with you." Hania hugged her hard and whispered, "Don't change for anyone." The wedding itself was a quiet storm of perfection. Crystal chandeliers, 1,000 flowers, guests who wore success like another layer of skin. Zayn arrived looking every inch the man everyone believed he was, immovable, precise, quietly dangerous in his control. He said the words a husband must say, signed the papers, performed the rituals with a formality that made the room breathe out in relief. He did not smile. He did not touch her more than the required gestures. He treated the wedding like a transaction, a clean line of duty fulfilled. Era told herself it was okay. She told herself patience was a kind of strength and that she would learn his rhythms, that under the steel she would find a heart that simply needed time. In the beginning she made small adjustments to her life to fit into his world, learning which way he liked his coffee, how he preferred the curtains drawn, where he put his keys. She learned the names of the staff and which of them kept the best secrets. She learned to move quietly through rooms that seemed constructed for echoes. But months became a year. The house had everything, suites that saw more maids than laughter, a dining table that could seat 12 but where he ate alone, an office that smelled of leather and late-night decisions. Zayn's touch was rare and functional, a cursory kiss on the forehead once when guests came, a hand lifted automatically to steady a champagne flute. His voice in the house was measured and short. He called her madam in front of people, and sometimes her name alone in private, as if the sound had been unexpectedly allowed. He never reached for her as a man reaches for his wife. He never leaned in when she spoke softly or stayed up to listen to a confession about a dream she had. He would walk past her in hallways and not see the way her dupatta fell crooked or how she tucked a stray hair behind her ear. At gatherings he would introduce her politely and then drift away to speak of contracts and board meetings. The staff took note. They got used to the quiet, too. Karim Chacha, who had watched the Maliks for decades, would lower his gaze in sympathy when he saw Era sitting alone on the balcony while the house sang with music beyond the curtains. Nights were the hardest. Era's bed was soft and wide, a moonlit island inside a room of velvet drapes. The silence that took over after the lights went out had a taste, at once bitter and familiar. She found herself whispering small Muslim prayers into the dark. Ya Allah, put my heart where it belongs. Give me patience. Give me a sign. She would often run her fingers over the embroidery on the comforter, listening for any sound that would prove she had not been forgotten. Sometimes she imagined Zayn standing at the window looking at the city, lonely in a way that matched her own loneliness. She hoped he might at least look at her like someone choosing a companion. At the same time, Zayn's life was not gentle. He endured phone calls at night, crisis meetings, the relentless pressure of being the name behind profits and reputations. He had a way of wearing pain beneath his clothes, a secret that made him flinch when anyone came too close. Era saw him once leaving his study in the morning with red-lined eyes, as if someone had drawn grief there the night before and then hurried him into a suit. She wondered what battlefields existed in the rooms he never allowed her into. She did not suspect then that there were ghosts in his evenings, not until later when a small slip of paper would change the whole house. People around them behaved as people do when love is absent. Some offered counsel, others judgment. Zayn's aunt, Mrs. Farrer watched with thinly disguised annoyance at her nephew's refusal to perform the domestic rituals that made a marriage presentable. A girl must be given purpose, she would say, more to hear her own voice than to guide. Hania scolded Era, but softly, hugging her shoulders and saying, "Don't waste yourself waiting." Era would smile and let the words land and then drift away like clouds. The world's advice was loud, her sister's warning was softer, gentler, and she chose patience instead. There were tiny, almost invisible kindnesses. Era found a rose placed on a side table once, the petals slightly satiny from Zion's fingers. She found a note under her pillow one morning that said, "Don't overwork. Sleep well." The handwriting was rigid, not fluent, as if someone had made a rare effort. She treasured that note and reread it until the ink blurred. These were the breadcrumbs she clung to. They said he saw her. They said he remembered. They said, perhaps, that he was not cruel, only distant. Work called both of them in different directions. Her days in the mansion were slow and quiet. She taught herself to read books from the library and occasionally lost herself in old novels about ordinary lives. Zion's days were a series of numbers and decisions. He was a mountain that never admitted to shaking. Once, a guest at a luncheon remarked, "You have everything, Zion." He had replied, dry and distant, "Everything has a price." He meant it about his businesses, but Era felt the words like a shadow over their intimacy. Everything in his life required a cost, including softness. Yet Era's heart kept finding ways to love the small openings he offered. She began to plant a tiny patch of marigolds near the servants' entrance because she wanted something that would bloom unaffected by marble and strictness. She learned to cook a simple rice that he approved of. She moved the pillows just as he liked them. Love can be an act of repetition as much as ceremony, and Era practiced persistence like a prayer. It cost her quiet days and lonely nights, but each small ritual felt like an offering, not to win him, necessarily, but to hold a space where affection might one day grow. One afternoon, as rain began to patter against the mansion's long windows, she stood in the doorway where the main hall met the library and watched his silhouette through the glass. Zion bent over papers, a presence of concentration. Oils of the rain made the garden smudge into watercolor, and for an instant, she imagined him as a man softened by grief, a sculpted figure with cracks. She thought of his life before the mansion, a boy who had worked his fingers raw, a young man who had loved fiercely, perhaps lost fiercely as well. She reasoned that maybe he had been hurt in ways she couldn't fix. Maybe he kept his hands off her because he was afraid to feel. She spoke aloud then, to the empty room, to the storm, to the man whose hands moved with purposeful precision. "If he fears me, then I'll be gentle. If he hides, then I'll wait." There was faith in that quiet promise, but beneath it was a sorrow she held as private as her pulse. That evening, Hania called. Her voice on the phone was a small sunburst. "How are you, Baji?" she asked, but already Era could tell she worried. "I'm fine," Era answered, because she was, under the careful surface of it all, just tired. "Don't take too much. Please come home for a weekend," Hania insisted. "You need to remember the sound of ordinary mornings." Era laughed softly. "Hania, my life is ordinary too, in its own way." "Do ordinary lives have silence like that?" Hania asked. There was tenderness and a little impatience in her words. Era didn't reply. She let the silence answer. As night fell that night and lights glazed the mansion in gold, she sat by the balcony and watched the city breathe. A stray dog barked in the distance, a child's laughter floated up from somewhere down the lane. In the warm hush of evening, she allowed herself to imagine small things, a hand that would tuck her hair behind her ear, a voice that would say "Come rest," a man who would not simply pass through her life like a guest. She wanted to be claimed. Not in grandeur, not with headlines or declarations, but in the simple language of being noticed. "You are mine. I will keep you." When sleep came fitful, it was full of dreams in which Zion looked at her and did not look away. She woke with a faint ache and pressed her palms to her chest like a child checking the warmth of a home. She told herself again that she would be patient. She whispered one last quiet prayer, "Ya Allah, if this marriage is the path, then show him my heart. If it is not, give me the strength to leave." In the great house, doors closed and lights dimmed. Zion left his office lights burning. Her bedside lamp stayed on until just before midnight. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked with indifferent regularity. Outside, Clouds moved like gentle thieves across the moon. There was a hush as if the world itself paused to listen. Era did not know then that destiny, a slow, deliberate thing, had heard her prayer. She did not know that beneath Zion's composed exterior there were old wounds that would one day make room for new tenderness. She did not know that the everyday patience she offered was enough to bend a man who believed himself unbending. She simply folded her hands under the blanket and prayed again into the dark, the words small and plain, the heartbeat steady, "Let what is meant be. Let me not lose myself." Outside the mansion, a wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and the soft sound of the city. The house slept, but hearts in it did not. One heart beat in waiting, the other in restraint. And somewhere between the two, something fragile and new began to stir. Destiny was listening. And the story of their love, as silent and stubborn as it had been so far, was about to begin in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Rain had a way of revealing what the sun refused to see. It washed the city sidewalks clean and left puddles that reflected neon signs and the hurried faces of strangers. At the Malik mansion, the rain drummed a slow, steady rhythm across the wide roof, and inside, it sounded like a metronome counting time that Era could not slow down. Morning rituals in the house were precise. The gardener trimmed hedges with mechanical patience, the cook arranged fruit in perfect symmetry, and the lights came on just as the clock in the hall chimed. Era had fallen into the rhythm of this new life, small, careful movements in rooms that had a way of swallowing noise. She brewed tea in a pot she had learned to love and placed 2 cups on a tray, more out of habit than hope. Zion came for breakfast the way a shadow crosses a room, inevitable, controlled, precise. He moved like a man accustomed to presence that did not require feeling. He took the cup she carried and nodded once, an acknowledgement that was more duty than warmth. "Black," he said, and the word hovered in the air more as instruction than conversation. She set down the tray and studied him for a second, the lines near his mouth like small closed doors. She wanted to ask 100 little things, how he slept, whether he had eaten, if the night had been kind, but the questions would have gone unanswered or, worse, met with the quiet that had become their currency. Instead she asked the smaller, safer things. "Will you be home for dinner tonight?" she tried, her voice barely above the hum of the morning. Zion lifted his gaze and for a moment she thought she might have breached something inside him. His eyes were cool and unreadable. "Don't wait for me," he said. "I'll be late." The words fell like a shutter closing. She smiled, thin and practiced. "Okay." When the door closed and his car disappeared down the drive, the house exhaled. Era moved through rooms like a ghost learning the memory of a home that had not been taught to hold hands. The servants were kind, they treated her with a mixture of reverence and pity. Kareem Chacha brought her a cup of tea and sat across from her on the veranda without being asked. "Batia, you must eat properly," he said, placing a steaming plate in front of her. "This business of waiting for someone who does not return is not for daughters. Don't let your body pay for their absence." She smiled sadly. "Chacha, patience is my choice. Maybe one day he will see me." Kareem Chacha's eyes crinkled with concern. "I have seen many seasons, Betty. But I have also seen that people do not change because you wait. They change when they fear losing something. If you are the only one waiting, then maybe the world is not listening." Era's fingers tightened around the cup. She wanted to argue, to say that love could be quiet and patient and that miracles sometimes arrived slowly. Instead she simply drank, letting the warmth move through her like a small, private blessing. That afternoon, she wandered into the library. Books had become a refuge, pages where people loved and argued and found themselves in sentences she could touch. She found a corner near the window and sat, as if the literature would teach her to wait more gracefully. Between chapter breaks, her mind returned to Zion, the curve of his jaw, the quiet stiffness in his shoulders, the way he folded things away to keep them whole. She had tried, in many ways, to keep herself whole too, but not with armor, with softness. When she reached for a porcelain vase to adjust a stray marigold, she noticed something on the side table, a leather-bound diary she had once assumed belonged to another life. It was closed, but not locked. Curiosity is a small, traitorous thing. She touched the cover with fingertips that felt both guilty and hungry. On top lay a photograph, half hidden beneath the diary's ribbon. Her breath caught. A woman smiled back at her from the photograph. She had the kind of smile that belonged to old films, as if light had been invented just for her face. Her hair fell in soft waves, and her eyes were open and laughing. Older handwriting curved along the back, "Forever, only you." The words were crisp, expressive, and unmistakably Zion's slanted script. Era's hands trembled. The photograph was attached with a paperclip, and when she turned the diary, she saw one page with a dried petal sewn between lines like a secret. The pages were full of dates and notes, places only Zion would visit, short phrases, unembellished confessions. It was a map of a life she'd been invited into but never shown. For a moment she felt as if she had opened a window into a room where someone else slept. Grief came in small, unannounced waves. She imagined laughs that were not hers reverberating through halls she had tried to fill with her own hum. She thought of the night she had wished for a touch and wondered whether the hands he reserved were ghosts' hands. She closed the diary carefully, like a person returning a borrowed pain. She moved the photograph back into its hiding place and sat down on the couch, the image of the woman and the words "forever, only you" pressed behind her eyes like a new, unwanted truth. That evening, she waited as usual. The house hummed softly. The chandeliers lit themselves, and music from a distant channel spilled like perfume. She stood by the balcony, watching raindrops racing down the glass and thinking of small, impossible things, a hand tucked into hers at night, a whisper in a tired ear, the casual claiming that keeps two people from becoming strangers. She whispered to the rain, "If you're human, bring me a sign." When Zion returned, late and perfumed with examination rooms and unsaid apologies, he paused in the doorway. He saw her there, slender in the lamplight. For an instant, something in him changed. It was just the fraction of a pulse, a memory catching up. He moved across the room but did not join her at the railing. He stood at arm's length, as if fearing gravity might make them collide. "Era," he said, the name like a small, deliberate offering. She turned. "Yes." He didn't take her hand. He didn't lean against the railing. He simply stated, as if clarifying a fact, "I will be traveling tomorrow. I need you to keep the house in order." The words were mundane, practical. The absence between them, however, was not. She nodded. "Of course." When he left the room, she turned the photograph over in her mind and pressed her palms to her chest as if to feel for a heartbeat that might not be hers. The diary had shifted something in her. It took the shape of questions so large they were almost unacceptable. How could you live with a ghost? How could you marry again when once you had loved so loudly? How could someone be present in name and absent where it mattered most? That night she sat by her window with a cup of tea that had grown cold. She thought of the photograph tucked inside Zion's diary and the words he had written, words that seemed to live inside him like a vow. There was a taste of betrayal she could not ignore, yet beneath it grew a quieter, more dangerous feeling, compassion. She remembered Zion's jaw clenching in moments of silence, the way his hands would tremble when a meeting recalled something he didn't want to name. She imagined a different tragedy, a love story that had been cut short by a sudden and irreversible absence, leaving a man with a map of memory but no map of return. Perhaps, she thought, Zion's refusal to touch her was not hatred but an act of preservation of something sacred and raw that he thought would break if he allowed himself to love again. In the late hours, she whispered a prayer, not for signs anymore, but for guidance. "Ya Allah, if he is trapped by the past, give me patience to hold the present. If he is capable of a new heart, let me be gentle." She did not say the words to change him. She said them so she could change herself. The days turned into a rhythm of small discoveries. She learned to rearrange the cushions he liked and keep the pantry stocked with his favorite snacks though he rarely ate them in the house. She learned the times the maid preferred to clean the study, so she would not intrude when he was there. It became a careful choreography of people who loved from a distance, Era learning her role as the living companion and Zion tending to his memory like a fragile relic. Sometimes, the smallest of human acts broke the silence, a tray with tea left for him at his study door, a note placed discreetly in a planner that said, "Don't forget to breathe." He never responded with words, but the notes were never thrown away. Ownership of small kindnesses can be a quiet language. She learned to speak it without expecting fluency in return. Outside their private lives, the world kept spinning. People at social functions viewed them through curated lenses. Zion applauded for corporate success, Era complimented for her quiet grace. Mr. Farhan, a retired teacher who lived 2 houses away, told Era once over tea, "You are very brave, Beta." She blushed and said nothing. Brave felt like the wrong word for quiet patience. She wished for strength less heroic and more human, the kind that let you get up again in the morning with your hands still shaking. And then, one afternoon, a small kindness turned into a small rupture. Hania called, her voice a whistle of heat and concern. Baji, you need to come home for a day. Please. Eat Ami's Halim. Your mother prays and worries. Her sister's pleading was a soft pressure Era couldn't dismiss. She smiled and told Zion she would visit for a day. He agreed without looking up from a folder. Drive safe, he said. Era left with a lightness she could not explain. For hours she breathed in neighborhood smells she had not known she missed, the scent of boiled vegetables on a windy afternoon, the slap of laundry against a clothesline. Hania's laughter patched over corners of her heart that had been frayed. Their childhood room was full of small things, photographs, a cracked teapot, childhood trophies with flaking gold. For an evening, she let herself be ordinary. Back at the mansion, Zion's routine faltered because of a delay that stretched into night. Era returned late, her hair damp from a sudden shower. She expected the house to feel the way it always did, polished, precise, prepared. But when she climbed the stairs, she noticed a small note tucked into the book on her bedside table. Her name was written in rigid script. Her pulse quickened. Don't worry about me. I'll be late. Eat. ZM. For a heartbeat she felt the warmth of being remembered. It was not a grand confession, not a dramatic reach, merely a practical instruction folded into an abbreviated signature. She kept the note, smoothing its creases with fingers that trembled. It seemed like a trifling thing to others, but in her world it was proof that she had penetrated even the smallest part of him. But the next morning, a mundane mistake peeled layers off any comfort it had given. In the library, while tucking a book back, she saw the diary again. This time the photograph had not been covered completely. A stray page, slipped, revealed a date, 3 years ago, a notation that coincided with many anniversaries people celebrate in memory and with grief. She traced the number with a fingertip and felt something cold and infinite. That evening she faced a truth that could not be soft-pedaled. Zion's heart had a place both for memory and for someone he had married after. He had chosen to remarry, to place Era legally and socially by his side, and yet, emotionally, there was a different altar. The discovery did not make her storm the house in dramatic fury, instead it taught her a sad, patient lesson. Not all marriages are made the way storybooks tell, and sometimes you are married to a man who loves you in the only way he knows how, through space, care, and quiet gestures, while another love lives as a living wound in his history. Era fell into a new kind of prayer then. She prayed for courage that would not be desperate, for boundaries that would not be brittle, and for wisdom to read whether this life could be lived in fragments or required wholehearted presence. She did not want to be a footnote in someone's devotion to the past, but she did not want to be cruel either. There was a tenderness in her that refused cruelty even when she was hurt. The rain returned. The city shimmered under street lamps. In the house, Zion's profile cut the last light as he left for the night. She watched him go, not with the starry expectations of a newlywed, but as a woman who had decided to love with her eyes open. Love, she discovered, could coexist with grief and still be chosen. It could be a deliberate practice, not a surrender. When she closed the window that night, she whispered to the dark, "If your heart will break for me, let it take time. I will not force it. If your heart cannot, let me have the courage to leave." It was both a prayer and an ultimatum, a small, human ultimatum wrapped in faith. She lay down and listened to the rain's steady drumbeat. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed, slow and certain. In the library the diary slept with its secret. In the study a photograph watched from behind glass. In 3 rooms a man, a woman, and a memory hummed in separate tones, not yet harmonized, but not yet extinguished. Era did not know how long she could stand in this gentle, aching place. She only knew that each day she rose she made a choice, to look, to wait, to tend, and to live. She had planted a little patch of marigolds by the servant entrance, and each morning they opened their faces to whatever sun there was. The flowers did not ask for history. They only asked for water. And Era, who had chosen patience not as resignation but as a hopeful labor, watered them with her hands that sometimes shook. Her love, quiet, steady, and brave, would become both her strength and her sorrow. Perhaps it would be the exact thing to crack a man's wall. Or perhaps it would teach her the hardest lesson of all, when to stay and when to step away. The rain slowed to a hush. The mansion settled into its nocturnal breath. Era pressed her forehead to the glass and watched the world refract downward in tiny, glittering tears. Her own heart was a slow drum, patient, aching, alive. Era slept with the diary under her pillow that night, though she told herself she only meant to hold the small, trembling object because it frightened her. Dawn seeped in pale through the curtains and caught the edges of the photograph like a secret in light. She woke with the weight of that smiling stranger in her chest, and a new kind of unease settled into the corners of the house. The photograph refused to be a small thing. Every time she blinked it appeared at the back of her eyes, the woman's laugh caught in motion, the tilt of her chin, the way the sunlight had threaded ribbons through her hair. Whoever she was, a friend, a lover, a memory, she had been important enough to live inside Zion's private pages. Era ran her thumb along the handwriting again, tracing the curve of "Forever, only you." The words were not merely ink, they felt like a lock, and Era realized with a cold clarity that she had married a man who still kept his heart under glass. She set the diary back on the bedside table and dressed slowly. Each movement became an act of steadiness, the way a bird fluffs itself before a storm. Hania called mid-morning, full of resolute cheer. She asked Era to come for lunch and chatter, to press her back into the ordinary rhythm of a life that still included raw laughter and the smell of frying onions. Era accepted without promise she would leave her thoughts behind. At the kitchen table, Hania reached into her bag and unfolded a newspaper with bright, gossipy headlines. "You should see the new charity gala list," she said. "Everyone is going and you must go. Era, you'll be the quiet light of the evening." Her sister's voice was an attempt at normalizing. She wanted to stitch the wound with chatter. Era smiled and nodded, but the diary lived in her pocket like a small, accusing stone. For the first time she began to see Zion not only as the man who refused to touch her but as someone who carried an entire other life in silence, a library of the past that explained his distance, not excused it. She loved him as a person might love the sound of a window in a storm. She wanted to mend it, not break it. But the photograph made it harder to simply be patient. It asked of her a decision, to remain in a house with another woman's footprints carved into its floors, or to retreat and protect the fragile parts of herself. That afternoon she walked the mansion's corridors with an odd observation of everything: the piano with its lid closed like a secret, the study's heavy curtains, the faint perfume of roses that lingered sometimes in the upstairs corridor, a scent she had never planted. Servants eyed her with cautious sympathy. The staff had long ago learned to read the room. Karim Chacha, who treated memories like heirlooms and offered advice like a soft shawl, found her arranging cushions in the sitting room and sat down beside her. "Betty," he said slowly, watching her fingers at the cloth, "you look like someone holding two breaths at once. Tell me." Era hesitated, then showed him the photograph. Karim Chacha's face folded like old paper. He had carried the house's history for years. He had been there the summers when laughter filled the rooms and the winters when a family buried its heart. "Mahira," he said after a long while, the name arriving with the hush of confession. That was Mahira. She was Zion's everything. He paused, watching the paper in her hand as though it might cut her. "She was gone before you came." The word "gone" landed with the weight of a slammed door. Era's chest shrank, an ache she hadn't expected rolling through her like cold tide. "How?" she asked, though not sure whether she wanted the answer or not. Karim Chacha's eyes glistened at the corners. "Car accident. It was sudden. They buried her quickly, some things we bury with the seasons." He swallowed. Zion never recovered. He married again because the family needed an heir and some semblance of life. But he kept Mahira in his heart. Betty. Men like him keep memories like lanterns in a dark house. Era sat very still. The house opened and closed around her like a chest with forgotten breaths. She felt both humbled and diminished, humbled because the man she had married had loved so deeply, diminished because she had been offered a place that may never have wanted to be inhabited. For the first time, she realized how complicated love could be, not the simple promise she had believed in, but a layered thing, full of old vows that shone even in the dark. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered. "Why hide it?" Karim Chacha laid a wrinkled hand over hers. "Because sometimes people protect others from the sharpness of truth. Or maybe he was protecting himself. It is easier to love a memory quietly than to risk loving again and failing." That night Era sat with the picture again and studied the laugh in the photograph like a language she had to learn. There was no malice in her heart, only a growing compassion that made her feel both brave and terribly naive. She thought of Zion standing alone under lamplight, of hands that had once been given freely to someone else and had never quite learned the new contours of tenderness. She thought of fate's cruelty and of the small softness she might apply like balm. Nevertheless, she was not willing to be an ornament on a shelf. She wanted to be seen, to be chosen. That desire was not a plea for dominance but an ordinary human need, to be wanted for who she was, not for how well she managed other people's grief. Days passed in a peculiar rhythm. She resumed her routines but with an added layer of awareness. She watched how Zion moved through rooms, the cigarette he left in an ashtray, the way he would stare at the window as if listening for an absent voice. She found herself leaving small things, a cup of coffee where he might find it, a note with a line from a poem she'd read that morning, even in silence, some hearts speak. She signed it with only her initial. These were tests of courage disguised as kindness. One evening, rain came hard and the mansion hummed with the comforting sounds of water on the roof. The lights were low. Zion was in his study, the lamp making a halo of yellow over his documents. Era carried 2 steaming cups and paused just inside the doorway. She had learned the exact rhythm of approaching him without startling, a dance of patience and hope. She set 1 cup down and hesitated. For the first time since the photograph, he looked up and saw her. The look that crossed his face was not wholly cold, it carried something like admission. He set down his pen and said, "You didn't have to come here." She sat, the chair creaking under her. "You seemed like you needed company," she said simply. He studied her as though weighing an unknown recipe. "You are kind," he said. The words were simple and not the kind of confession that fixes things, but they were unusual enough that Era felt them like a small door opening. They spoke of nothing and everything, of weather that had become odd, of an old book Era had found in the library, of a stray dog that liked the marigolds. Conversation itself felt like a first step across ice. At one point, a thunderclap made the lamp tremble and the candlelight flicker. Zion reached across, and in an automatic motion steadied the candle with his fingers. The tips of his hand brushed her palm. It was not a kiss. It was not even a lingering touch. It was, instead, the kind of small, inadvertent contact that an entire life can hang upon. For both of them, it carried the weight of a promise that had yet to be spoken. Era's breath caught, something in her throat loosened. Zion's eyes, when they met hers, were not empty anymore. For a breath they were 2 people in a room, not 2 shapes occupying a space. When the moment passed, they retreated into comfortable silence. He finished his tea. She left the room with the faint, bright hope that sometimes lights a woman's chest after small mercies. The photograph still existed in the study, tucked in a diary like an echo, but now there was a new memory, a light touch, a shared space, a flicker of warmth. That night Era prayed not for miracles, but for steadiness. "Ya Allah, grant me courage to love with my eyes open. Grant me patience, yes, but also the wisdom to know when waiting is an act of faith and when it is surrender." She thought of Mahira with the tenderness of someone recognizing ghosts, and she thought of Zion with the fierce cleavage of someone loving a living man who needed another chance. She did not know what would come next. Love does not always gift maps, sometimes it offers only compasses and trust. But she let herself sleep with the diary back where she found it, not because she wanted to guard the past, but because she had decided to try and live within the present, with all its shadows and all its possible new light. Outside, rain slowed to a hush. The mansion breathed quietly as if holding a secret breath and slowly letting it out. Inside, 2 people continued a conversation that had not yet become a language. Between their silences and their small acts of grace something fragile began to form, a possibility. A possibility that a wounded heart could learn to beat again beside a brave one. The mansion had 1,000 rooms but only a few held warmth. The rest stored echoes, footsteps that no longer belonged, laughter on loop, a piano that remembered a hand that no longer visited its keys. For Era, every corridor was a careful study of what used to be and what had been given to her to fill. Morning light found her kneeling in the conservatory arranging fresh flowers. She liked the act of it, choosing stems, stripping thorns, setting them straight in cool water. It was a small, human thing she could control. The flowers would not judge her for expecting life where a house demanded stillness. Zion walked in without announcing himself. He moved through the plants like a shadow moving through glass, precise, soundless. For a second she did not speak. She let the leaves brush her hands and watched his expression as he paused by the fountain. "You placed these," he said, not asking, not accusing. There was a rawness to his voice that surprised her. It was not the usual clipped tone but something softer, almost reluctant. She smiled, folding a stem. "Marigolds and lilies today. I thought the lilies would look good on your desk." His jaw tightened the way it did when he had contained an old sorrow. He stared at the lilies, then looked away. "She liked lilies," he said simply. Era felt the room tilt. The words landed like a stone in clear water and pushed out rings of meaning. She had known Mahira's name for months now, understood that it lived in Zion like an unhealed bruise. Still, hearing it aloud in the room she had been tending felt different, like walking into an old wound and finding it still raw. "You can have them," she offered, trying to sound casual. "If you want." He shook his head. "No. Keep them for the kitchen." His face closed over like a door. He turned and left, leaving her with the scent of lilies and the echo of the sentence. After he'd gone, she placed a small note on the table. "If the lilies are for memories, I will water them too." She did not expect a response. She only wanted the tenderness of saying something out loud that would not hurt anyone, even if it was only herself. Days folded into each other with the slow accuracy of a metronome. Zion's distance never became cruelty. It remained a quiet remoteness that seemed, paradoxically, to protect rather than punish. He would speak when required, appear at dinner hours, sign papers, host guests. He would buy Era the finest shawls and the kitchen the best saffron. Yet the house still smelled sometimes of roses that she had not planted, a ghost scent on the stairs, a memory holding onto corners like a second skin. One evening, Era found the piano lid slightly ajar. It had been untouched since her arrival. A dusty silk scarf, the kind women sometimes left behind in the small hurry of leaving for a party, lay across the keys. She ran her hand over the smooth wood and thought of the fingers that might have once danced there. The scarf smelled faintly of something she could not name, a perfume that seemed older than the present. "People keep ghosts for a reason," Karim Chacha said when she told him later. He shuffled his feet on the kitchen tiles, the place where truths often arrived in slow, practical sentences. "Some ghosts are prayers you never answer. Some are promises you cannot break." Era listened, folding another set of napkins. "But how do you live with it, Chacha? How do you love someone who keeps a memory like a lamp he never turns off?" Karim Chacha watched her and smiled sadly. "You learn the shape of the house, Betty. You sweep in the corners the ghosts miss. You make a tea that is yours and leave it on the table when they forget to eat. Maybe you do these small things until the living thing in the house remembers how to breathe again." She took that as instruction more than counsel. The next morning she placed a small cup of black coffee and a plain note on Zion's desk. "Eat. Don't let work feed your nights." She signed it simply, A. When she passed the study later, she saw the cup tilted, the coffee cooled, and the note folded and tucked under weight, not thrown away. She kept a quiet joy for that small mercy. Their interactions shifted by degrees, a hand brushing a sleeve in a crowded room, a shared look over the rim of a teacup, each a hesitant step on glass. Era began to notice the private things, the way Zion left his scarf in a particular chair when he planned to return soon, the way he sometimes hummed without meaning to, a tiny fragment of melody she would later find in the margins of an old music book. It was as if the house kept breaking open into small offerings and then closing again. But alongside these small, encouraging moments, things happened that made Era's heart crack into single, sharp sounds. One afternoon, while carrying a tray through the hallway, she overheard voices in the drawing room, voices raised, clinical and cutting. Mrs. Farrer, with her sharp-edged opinions, was speaking in a tone that left no room for subtlety. "Era is sweet," she said to Zion's cousin, loud enough for the corridor to hear, "but she must produce an heir. This talk of grief is sentimental. The family cannot wait." Era's hands went numb. The word heir thudded into the house like a hammer. For a woman who had grown up with simple blessings and quiet prayers, such calculations felt like instruments of erasure. Zion, who had been standing near the window, turned slowly. His face was unreadable, but his jaw twitched. He did not reply. He rarely did. Instead, he walked away to the library, the weight of other people's expectations folding over his shoulders like a heavy coat. That night, she lay awake thinking of lineage and love and the cruelty of measures that treat human hearts like investments. She thought of Mahira and how cruel fate had been to her. She thought of herself, of choosing to live in a house where she was measured against absence. The thought nearly made her laugh with shame, that love might be a ledger and longing a debt. She walked to his study. The door was open just a crack. Light from his desk lamp painted a rectangle on the rug. Zion's silhouette sat hunched, his head bowed, as if heavy with calculation and memory. Era stepped inside and stood at the doorway. "Why do you keep thinking you must be everything to everyone?" she asked softly. It was not a confrontation, it was a question from the place of someone who had watched him try to carry too many ghosts at once. He did not lift his head at first. Then slowly he turned. For a heartbeat, his face was unguarded. The mansion dropped its decorum and revealed a man raw at the seams. "Because once, choosing felt easy," he said, voice thick. "It felt like forever. But after losing her, I learned that forever can be taken away in a single day. I am terrified of loving and then being emptied." Era crossed the room without thinking and sat opposite him. This time, she did not bow into the role of patient supplicant. Instead she spoke as an equal, as someone who also knew the fragility of hearts. "Being afraid is not a reason to make someone else small," she said. "You lost once. That does not mean the only way to keep love safe is to lock it away and forget you ever had it." His eyes met hers, exhausted, storm-bright. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to say something messy. "I don't know how to do this without hurting you, Era. I don't know how to be a man who loves again." Her fingers found his on the table, tentative, not demanding. "Then let me teach you," she whispered. "Not by forcing anything, but by being here. Let me be the proof that living with a ghost doesn't mean living alone." He looked at their joined hands, at the tiny pulse under her skin, and for a moment the study was not a room of money and memory but a small, fragile habitat where two people might learn to survive together. But just as they sat there, a knock cut through the moment like cold wind. Mrs. Farrar stood in the doorway, her expression a mask. She came in with the kind of purpose that makes dust tremble. "Enough," she declared. "You sit here making sentimental speeches while the family's reputation dips. Zion, when will you act? Love is fine but business is finer. People watch, and if whispers start, who will take care of our name?" Her tone implied lineage was the only true loyalty. Zion's jaw tightened. He stood up as if the words were a physical blow. He did not argue. He listened. He had a habit of absorbing storms without retaliating. Era felt the space between him and herself widen again. The fragile warmth they had built flickered like a candle in a hallway wind. When Mrs. Farrar left, the house felt colder. Era glanced at Zion, at the lines of pain around his eyes that seemed older than the years he'd lived. She realized that in this house, love would not only have to survive grief, it would have to survive expectations, gossip, measured hands. She stayed, that night and the nights that followed, tending small things. She watered the lilies in the kitchen, she ironed his shirts gently, she left a warm cup on his desk. She did not demand declarations. She only asked for one small kindness in return, to be acknowledged as more than a shadow. And sometimes, that small kindness arrived. A note returned folded, a glance that lingered a second too long, a coat placed over her shoulders when night turned sharp. Each small mercy was a building block. Each silence she kept was not surrender but a decision to learn the architecture of his grief, to find the doors that would open to the future. But the mansion held many rooms, and not all of them opened easily. The ghost of Mahira would live inside the piano and under the lilies for years to come. Whether Era could make a place beside that memory, not as a thief but as a companion, was a question the house would watch like a slow, patient jury. Outside, the moon climbed like a pale coin in a velvet sky. Inside, two people sat with their cups cooling, hands sometimes touching, conversations starting and stopping like tremors. The lilies breathed their soft perfume and the mansion listened. In the hush before sleep, Era whispered into the dark, "Teach me how to hold you without breaking." And somewhere in the study, Zion answered softly, though he did not know if he believed his own words, "Try." Rain had a way of softening the world's edges, turning the city into a watercolor of lights. That evening the storm arrived like a messenger, sudden, insistent. The Malik mansion, all glass and carved stone, hummed as the wind leaned into it. Lamps flickered, curtains sighed. Inside, little rituals rearranged themselves, candles were lit, the power hiccuped, and in the hush that followed, rooms felt more honest. Era like rain. It was a tidy, honest thing that washed away dust and left everything smelling like renewal. She moved slowly through the halls carrying a tray of tea, the clink of porcelain oddly loud in a house that had learned to hide its sounds. She paused at the study door. Through the glass she could see Zion's shape, a stooped silhouette bent over files as though the night demanded numbers be fought into order. Her thumb hovered over the door handle. For months she had learned small courtesies, to enter when invited, to stand out of the way, to let him walk the path he had drawn. Tonight something in her wanted to step beyond those invisible lines. She set the tray on the desk with hands that barely trembled and said, simply, "You don't have to work tonight. The rain is beautiful." He looked up, surprised in a way she had not seen before. The surprise did not make him soften, it made him still. He set down his pen and regarded her like a man considering a new map. For one fraction of time his face lost its carefully carved edges. "You don't have to stay," he said, not quite a refusal but not exactly an invitation either. She smiled, small and steady. "I want to." She crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite, the lamp casting a pool of warm light that made her bruise of loneliness visible. Outside, the rain drummed a calm rhythm, and in that steady beat, they discovered something neither of them had named. Conversation began as if it had been rehearsed, trivial things, the kind that keep two strangers from sliding into silence. Era spoke of a book she had stumbled upon in the library, and Zion, against the habit of his life, commented on the author, surprised at his own memory. The air between them was brittle but changing. The distance that had been measured by years of practice felt for a moment like a gap they could learn to step across. When a thunderclap made the candle flicker, his fingers moved almost without thinking to steady the light. His hand brushed hers, brief, accidental in intention but monumental in consequence. The contact sent something bright and dangerous through Era's chest, a small explosion of warmth that made the air taste of possibility and fear at once. Zion froze. For a breath or two neither spoke. It was as if both had stumbled into the thin place where grief and hope met and held their breath, afraid to set the other alight. After she left the study that night, Era's hands shook around her cup. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, a brush of hands, a courtesy, but inside it felt like the first crack in a wall that had resisted storms for years. The crack was small and hairline, but it let in light. The next morning, routine tried to reassert itself. Zion departed for meetings and Era resumed her small domestic revolutions, a pot of soup left simmering in the kitchen, the marigolds trimmed, a note tucked into his briefcase, "Don't forget to eat." She did not expect reaction. She never did. But in the study, later that day, his assistant found the note folded and placed gently in a compartment of his planner. It was a small triumph, his silence seemed less absolute. Every day a pattern of tiny mercies stitched them closer. Zion's touch remained cautious. He did not reach for her as a lover reaches for a beloved. Rather, he tested the temperature of living again like a man testing water after a long winter, wary, tentative, mindful of burning. Then, an ordinary thing cracked the surface, the driver called sick. An important meeting got delayed. Timing, which had always been a wedge between them, aligned that morning when Era offered, almost offhand, to drive him to the office. "You drive?" he asked, eyebrows lifting in quiet surprise as he took his place in the passenger seat. The car moved through drizzle-silvered streets, and for the first time since their marriage, they rode side by side without the suffocating presence of staff or schedule separating them. On a traffic light, a boy selling flowers tapped on Era's window. On impulse, Era bought a single white rose, its petals unblemished, and smiled at the boy. She turned and placed it beside Zion, an absurd, tender act that felt like defiance and prayer in the same breath. He didn't speak. He took in the rose as if it were evidence of some small miracle. Later, when she returned home, he left the flower in a glass of water on his desk. She noticed, more than noticed, she catalogued the small tenderness like scripture. But tenderness, like any weather, can be complicated by storms of other kinds. Late that week, Zion's aunt, Mrs. Farrer, came to the house wearing the kind of smile that meant verdict. She hovered at the edge of the drawing room like a hawk, her voice low and sharp. 3 years, and still no heir, she murmured loudly enough to let the words ricochet into the room. A marriage without purpose is the world's buffet for gossip. Era felt the words like cold rain. Zion's face did not change. He did not tell her she was seen or loved or worthy. He simply turned and left the room. The silence afterwards roared. That night as Era folded clothes in her room, she could not file away the sting. She pressed the fabric to her chest and tried to breathe through the ache of being measured by others. She loved him. She had loved him quietly and without condition. Yet in this house, love was constantly evaluated, counted, and weighed by standards she had never agreed to. She walked into the garden to steal some air. Under the heavy leaves, she found Zion seated on the stone bench, a figure carved by moonlight. He looked older, smaller than the image the city placed on his shoulders. He didn't startle when she sat with him. For once the mansion was not listening, only the rain above them paid attention. "Do they always do this?" she asked simply, voice athread. He exhaled slowly. "Always," he said. Then he added, softer, "They do not understand that grief is not negotiable." There was a pause and then finally, almost against his own training, he reached for something else. "But maybe I have been unfair to you," he said, the words stumbling out with the awkwardness of a man who had trained his life to avoid such exposures. Era's eyes lifted, searching. The clouds parted with a soft sigh. She let herself be naive enough, for a moment, to hope that this was the beginning of clear confession. Yet, as the moon traced the hem of her japata, she felt a small caution in the marrow of her bones. Hope could be a dangerous thing, the years of waiting had taught her. The days that followed were full of small, eccentric tests. Zion began to do things he had not done. He called to ask about a meal, he paused to ask if she had slept well. He did not make grand declarations. He did something harder, he let himself be noticed. Era reciprocated, not with demands, but with the same steady generosity she had shown since the beginning. She listened, she gave space, she kept her heart patient yet guarded. Then, one ordinary afternoon pushed the fragile normal sideways. Era, balancing a tray of tea, stumbled near the stairs. The tray tilted, china threatened to cascade in a broken arc, time lengthened in the way that happens when something catastrophic feels imminent. Zion, who had been walking past, moved in a reflex so quick it seemed to surprise even him. His hand closed over her wrist, steadying her. For an instant she felt electricity, not of lust or drama, but of recognition, a human saved from a fall by another human. Their eyes locked. He had the look of a man who had been caught off guard by his own muscle memory. He released her hand almost at once, as if touching her had been a trespass on a grave. "Be careful," he said, voice brittle. She swallowed, heart racing. "Thank you." The moment was not cinematic in the way lovers dream. It was raw and ordinary and terrifying. It left impressions, fingerprints on the edges of her day. That night, alone in her room, she took off the bracelet he had given her in the months before, a small silver thing, and held it between her fingers. It had felt token-like when she first received it. Now it felt like the first real piece of him she could touch without permission. She slid it onto her wrist, and as it settled, she understood that this was how people began to claim each other, not with great declarations but with 1,000 small returns. But every small returning rings with the danger of backward glances. In the study, she had seen the diary with Mahira's photograph. In the garden, the lilies and the piano held memory like a second presence. She loved him, and in loving him she also learned to respect the shape of his past, and to guard the edges of her own self from being drowned by it. As the week wound down, an invitation arrived, a charity event, glittering and public. The house buzzed. Mrs. Farrer insisted Era attend. The rumor mills of society were unforgiving, and the aunt intended to show the world that everything was in order. Era donned a simple dress, soft and unpretentious. She looked drawn but luminous in a way that had nothing to do with jewels. Zion appeared beside her in a dark suit, his presence like a straight line beside her soft curve. For an intoxicating second she imagined the world pausing and offering them a fresh start. He placed his hand at her back as they descended the stairs, a small, protective gesture that made her breath hitch. At the event, they were a picture. Cameras found them, guests murmured, and the night assumed a script of success. Zion introduced Era with the same pride and reserve he offered many things. She smiled and moved through the room, collecting small conversations like soft currency. But later, as they stood gazing at the city lights from the venue's terrace, Era felt the old, familiar hollow settle. She turned to him, needing to see the line where grief met the living. "Tonight," she said softly, "did you ever feel like coming closer?" He looked at her then, the city a glittering bruise behind his silhouette. His voice came from a place that had been kept small for too long. "I feel many things," he admitted. "Fear mostly. Fear of losing what I have left." She let out a breath that could be anger or forgiveness. "You can't protect everything by standing still. Sometimes we have to risk falling to learn how to be held." He swallowed, and for the first time his hands didn't fidget. He took a breath that had more than business inside it. "I don't want to lose you, Era. Not now." Those words, shaky, unpolished, were not yet love's settled claim. They were a beginning, they were admission. They were a first crack in a man's carefully stacked fortress. As they left the event and the car carried them home, the rain returned, gentler, as if to wash away the night's tension. Inside the mansion, the rooms held their breaths. Era's heart thrummed with a strange, uneasy hope. Zion's chest eased with a release he had barely dared to imagine. There would be more misunderstandings, more tests, and darker days ahead. The past would not simply vanish, and the house would keep its ghosts. But the first crack in the walls had appeared, hairline and honest, a fault through which light seeped. When she lay down that night, Era pressed her palm to the bracelet glinting on her wrist and whispered a prayer of cautious gratitude. "Why Allah, let this be true. Let him learn." And outside, rain on the roof sang in a rhythm like the patient beat of a heart learning to trust again. For a few weeks after the rain touch moment, the mansion breathed easier. Small things changed their usual choreography. Zion left his phone on the dining table sometimes. He did not always eat alone. He began to answer when Era spoke, though not always completely. The house hummed with a cautious optimism as if two people were mapping a new route through an old city of grief and habit. Era allowed herself tiny celebrations. She planted another row of marigolds near the servants' gate. She learned how Zion liked the cushions aligned on the sofa and, for the first time, placed a tray with his coffee exactly when he wanted it. It felt like diplomacy and devotion rolled into one. She did not ask for grand things. She wanted only to be noticed in the ordinary ways that make a life belong. But a life lived in public is never only private. People watch, they whisper, and relatives keep the ledger of reputations ready to be balanced. One morning, as sunlight poured through the dining room windows, Mrs. Farah swept into the room like a gust of winter. She wore a new sari, glossy and opinionated. Around her, the family members who lingered for morning tea pretended not to listen, but their ears were hungry. "Era," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "a woman must give purpose to a household. There is only so much patience people will admire. 3 years, and still whispers." She lifted a finger as if pointing to a calendar. "The world asks questions. Society does not forgive empty promises." Era's fingers tightened around her teacup. Her pulse, which normally lived in gentle measures, began to skip. She had heard hints before, subtle comments, the odd look in a guest's eye, but to have it spoken, in that thin, rattling voice, made the words bone deep. Zion sat silent at the head of the table, jaw set like iron beneath skin. He did not rise in defense. Instead, he said nothing and finished his tea with a practiced nonchalance. The silence that followed was louder than any heated argument. Later, when the guests had dispersed, Era found Karim Chacha in the kitchen, wiping his hands on an apron though the sun had only just climbed. He looked at her with the kind of pity born from decades of seeing human hearts bruise. "Chacha," she asked, voice small, "did she say that because it's true?" Karim Chacha took a long breath. People will say what pleases their tongues. But words cut deep when they come from inside the house. Mrs. Farah thinks in ledgers and bloodlines. She believes in heirs and names. He tapped his chest lightly. "Your place is not a ledger, Betty. But she will not stop. You must hold your ground." Era smiled, but it was brittle. Holding ground felt honorable in theory and lonely in practice. She retreated to her room like someone tucking away a fragile thing. That afternoon, Haider, a junior executive from Zion's company and an old acquaintance from before the marriage, called with a business question. It was a simple call, but their conversation reminded Era that she had a life outside the mansion's hushed corridors, friends, memories, a world where people laughed without timing it for gossip. She decided to visit the small bazaar near her sister's home, to buy spices and feel the ordinary press of market life. At the market she ran into Ryan, a college friend she hadn't seen in years. Ryan had the easy laugh of someone who never measured words for consequence. He greeted her like the old Era, full of warmth and a memory of simpler days. "Era, it's you," he said, eyes lighting up. He embraced her as friends do in towns where hugs are a language. People turned, they nodded, life hummed like a stringed instrument returning to tune. They spoke of nothing heavy, the new cinema, the teacher who retired, the chai stall owner who always burned his kettles. Era laughed freely, the sound unclipped by mansion etiquette. She bought spices, sampled a stray samosa, told Ryan about Hanya's stubborn plans to visit. It felt like a small protest against the house of glass life she led, like she was reclaiming a bit of herself. Unseen by both of them, a car stopped at the corner. Zion's driver had been called back to the mansion, and Zion, restless and unable to quiet his thoughts, had driven out without telling anyone. His path through the streets was aimless until the sight of Era's familiar japata among the market stalls snagged him like a hook. He watched from the shadows first. He saw Era laugh and tilt her head the way she did in the courtyard when she had found a new book. He saw Ryan's easy smile. For a clean, crystallized second, he felt something he had not invited, a cold flare of possessiveness he could not quite name. Not jealousy in the petty sense, but a sharp, untrained grief that rose when he realized the woman he had been ignoring belonged to another world as well. Zion's hands tightened around the steering wheel. He saw a vendor hand Era a paper parcel and Ryan brush a smudge of flour from her cheek. The simple domestic gesture landed in Zion like an accusation. He stepped out of the car and moved closer, fingers clenching and unclenching. A rational part of him whispered that their meeting meant nothing, that they were friends, that Ryan had been part of her life long before the mansion's existence. But emotion is rarely rational. It is an animal in the chest that smells threat and reacts before thought. He cleared his throat and called her name. The sound made Era start. Ryan turned, smiling in that comfortable way, and greeted Zion with a respectful nod. For a split second everything was ordinary again, two men acknowledging each other, a woman caught between both worlds. Era stepped toward Zion with a smile, a small bridge already forming to close the distance. "Zion. You," she began, but her words caught when she saw the look in his eyes. It was not the touch of ordinary surprise or tiredness. It was cold and hard, the glance of a man who had been wounded. "Who is this?" Zion asked, his voice low and controlled but carrying a cut that made the words sharper than intended. Ryan, unruffled, extended a hand. "Ryan, college friend. Era and I studied together." The handshake was polite. But Zion's jaw tightened. "College, yes," he said. Then, more sharply, "Why were you laughing with her?" Era opened her mouth to answer, to explain the ordinary things, but the heat of indignation and hurt rose inside her like a tide. "Because he is a friend," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We were buying spices. Nothing more." Zion's face shifted. He had not meant to sound accusing. But accusation had the strange habit of arriving when a heart had been kept in the cold. "Do not presume familiarity where there is none," he said then, more to himself than to anyone else, and turned away. Era's throat closed. The phrase, "do not presume familiarity where there is none," was a formal dismissal that reduced her mirth in front of strangers to a liability. It implied that her place was a label to be managed, not a person with memories or friendships. Ryan looked between them, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. He stepped back with the quiet grace of someone who had watched a delicate thing crack and did not want to widen it. Zion left with his stride quick and precise, his car melting into traffic while Ryan's figure remained rooted in the market like a benign island. The scene had a simplicity that would have been laughable if it weren't sharp enough to cause bruises. Era stood for a long time among sacks of spices and the smell of fried bread, the colors around her dulling as if someone had turned down the saturation on her life. She called Hania and told her nothing of interest, her voice was a thin thing. She held the sparing warmth of the market in her hands and found it suddenly complicated, tinted by the metallic taste of accusation. She had not asked for Zion to follow her. She had not imagined laughter could lead to suspicion. But there it was, The mansion's old pattern had surfaced again, misunderstanding tied to the past, quick to pin blame. That night, when Zion returned home, he found the house quiet and too orderly. He found a teacup left on the table with a note tucked beside it, Era's handwriting gentle and domestic, "Hope the meeting went well. Don't skip eating." The note, which had once been a balm, now pricked him like a reminder of the small things he had begun to ignore and the deeper, rawer wounds he had disguised with control. He took the note and did not fold it neatly into his planner. Instead, he pressed it into his palm as if to test whether it was warm or cold. There was no immediate answer. Grief had a strange geometry, sometimes its edges cut where love should be soft. Era watched him from the staircase, her expression unreadable. She had expected anger, coldness, perhaps even a simple apology for the way he had spoken. Instead she saw a man trapped in his own feelings, a man whose past kept pulling him backward even as his present slipped from his hands. "Why do you not trust me?" she asked later in the quiet of the drawing room, when the chandeliers were dim and the house seemed to wait for a verdict. Zion's eyes were red at the corners. He listened, and for the first time his voice broke with a note that was neither distance nor command. "Because I am scared," he said, the words falling out like something he hadn't intended to confess. "Because I have lost once, and the idea of losing again makes me unfair." Era's shoulders sagged with a relief and a new sorrow. There was no triumph in his admission, only the weary confession of a wounded man. "Scared or not," she whispered, "you wounded me today with that tone. Jealousy is not a gift. It is an admission you care, yes, but not a permission to hurt." He closed his eyes as if to block the memory of the anger that had slipped out of him. "I know," he said. "I am sorry." The apology landed like small, fragile glass. It could be enough. It could also be the beginning of another cycle: jealousy, confession, reconciliation, silence. Era wanted a steady hand, not patterns of hurt followed by regret. She wanted to be chosen every day, not claimed in crisis. That night neither of them slept easily. Each wrestled with private questions. Can grief be shared without making the one who survives its victim? Can patience become dependence? Can a heart buried under memory learn to beat for the living? Outside, the city hummed on, oblivious. Inside the mansion, two people slept on separate sides of a bed that had not yet learned to hold them both. The lilies in the kitchen drooped slightly as if exhausted by the day's tensions. Someone murmured a prayer in the dark, Era for courage, Zion for a way to live without suffocating himself with the past. And beneath all this, a small, dangerous seed took root, the knowledge that jealousy had shown itself. Jealousy can sometimes be a bridge, an admission that love exists. Sometimes it is a knife. Which would it be for them? Neither could say. In the quiet before dawn, Era opened her diary and wrote with a hand that did not tremble as much as she expected, "I will not become an echo. I will not be invisible. If you love me, show me." She folded the page and tucked it away like a promise. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed. The sound was small, precise, and somehow accusatory. The morning would bring new faces, new conversations, and perhaps more whispers. Both of them knew the next day would be a test, not of grand gestures, but of the tiny choices that stitch two lives together. After the market incident, the mansion did something it had never done before. It learned silence as a new language. Not the polite, passing silence of a well-run household, but the heavy, deliberate silence of people who keep small wars inside their chests. Era changed in ways Zion noticed and could not name. She still moved through rooms with her quiet grace, still tended plants and books, but she no longer looked at him the way she had in those early months. No hopeful glances, no notes tucked into his bag. Where there had once been a tenderness that waited for reply, there was now a careful distance like someone stepping around broken glass. He tried to measure the change. In the mornings he found his coffee exactly how he liked it. In the evenings he found his notes folded and untouched. He had behaved like a man accustomed to silence, until silence became a mirror showing him what he had lost. One evening, Zion returned earlier than usual. Work had ended sooner, a meeting had been cancelled, the emptiness of the house called to him. He expected the rooms as they had always been, still, obedient, sleeping under the moon's indifferent light. Instead, he found Era at the piano. It had been years since anyone played there. Her fingers, hesitant at first, found a simple melody, one so fragile it seemed apologetic. The sound filled the hall and startled him in a way a shout never could. He closed the study door behind him and stood in the doorway, watching. She didn't look up. The song went on, slow and thoughtful, notes trembling. For the first time in a long time, Zion felt the hollow inside him echo back a different tone, a tone that sounded like regret. When she finished, she wiped her hands on her dupatta and stood. He crossed the room without thinking, drawn by a gravity he had refused to acknowledge. He stopped a foot from her and said, quietly, "You play well." She smiled without warmth. "It's simple." "Play again," he asked, and the word surprised him with its softness. She hesitated, then Saturday. Her fingers traced the keys and the melody rose once more. He listened until the last note faded and then, as if the need could no longer be kept from words, he spoke. "Era," he began, voice raw in the small room. He had rehearsed things in his head 1,000 times and knew none of them fit. "I am sorry. For the way I have been. For the things I said. For what I did not say." She closed the piano lid gently and looked at him. There was no young, eager acceptance in her eyes. Instead, there was a tired dignity that made him feel like a trespasser. "Sorry," she echoed. "Words are easy, Zion. You have said many things before." Her voice did not accuse, it simply stated a fact he could not ignore. He swallowed. "I know. I do not want to be easy anymore." He stepped closer, the lights catching at the edge of his jaw. "I want to try. If you will let me." Her fingers curled around the edge of the piano bench. "Trying is different from waiting," she said slowly. "Trying is moving. Waiting is standing still." Her gaze went through him, into a place where he had stored his grief and turned it into a fortress. He felt the truth of it hit him like cold rain. "I'm tired of being frozen," he whispered. "I do not want to be the man who only remembers what is lost." Era looked at him then, fully, with a softness that was not vulnerability but the dangerous generosity of someone who had held her heart in her hands and chosen not to throw it away. "If you mean it, show me," she said. "Not with speeches. Not with roses left in vases. With small things that last. Come when I speak, ask when I am quiet, stand with me in the room even when the world asks you to be somewhere else." He nodded as if each rule she named was a stone he could place to rebuild what he had shattered. "I will try," he vowed. They did not embrace that night. They did not fix everything with a single desperate act. Instead, they discovered a necessary, awkward beginning, the admission that both of them had been wounded and that healing would require more than words. It required patience, small rituals, and time. But people do not exist in private bubbles. Even as Zion walked a little more consciously through the house, other forces stirred. Mrs. Farrar watched the fragile progress with hawkish eyes, suspicious of any tenderness that might scandalize the family ledger. She whispered warnings in drawing rooms and at dinner tables, turning public opinion into a weapon. "A man must be decisive," she told relatives. "Not be led by whims." Era felt Mrs. Farrar's scrutiny like weather. It made her stand straighter but also hollowed out something ordinary inside. She began to keep her answers short at gatherings and to practice smiling like a woman who knew how to survive criticism. Yet in the privacy of her room, she wrote in her diary, "I will not be erased. I will not be a pause in his life. If he wants me, he must learn to keep me." Outside the house, the city spun with small dramas. Hania called often, bringing gossip and the warmth of home. She told Era to be careful, to set boundaries, to remember she had a life beyond the mansion's walls. "You are not a shape to be filled," Hania would say. "You are a person who can choose." Era's choices pulled at Zion like threads he had forgotten were attached to him. He began to wake with the intention of doing what he could to prove his words. He left small notes, not the formal, distant ones before, but ones with a line of poetry or a memory tucked inside. He learned what she liked for tea. He walked into rooms without urgent purpose, just to be present. Slowly, like dawn crawling under curtains, those small acts made cracks in the ice he had built around himself. But cracks can let light or cold in, neither of them could be sure which would come. Then, fate, or perhaps the universe's terrible timing, delivered a test. During a weekend where relatives gathered to celebrate a distant uncle's birthday, a rumor floated through seated conversations like cigarette smoke, a whisper that Zion's company might be restructuring, that old partners eyed his choices with hunger. Mrs. Farrer's voice hardened into sudden defense. Her public scolds at family lunches turned to private barbs meant to sharpen him into caution. Era watched the scene from the edges, her presence almost ceremonial. She had begun to care whether his reputation stood intact because it mattered to him, and if he was part of her world, it mattered to her, too. For the first time, the notion of fighting his battles, not merely tolerating them, entered her heart. When the argument crescendoed and Zion retreated to his study, Era followed without thought. The house smelled of boiling tea and anxious perfume. She stopped outside his door, listening to the measured sound of his breathing as if it were music. He did not look up when she entered. His shoulders were hunched, his hands trembled as he sifted through papers. For a moment they sat in companionable silence that was not avoidance but a shared exhaustion. Then, quietly, she placed her hand on his shoulder. He flinched, then relaxed, the muscles easing like someone who had not allowed himself to breathe in a long while. He turned to her and, with a voice that was almost humility, said, "Stay." She stayed. Not because he commanded it but because she chose to, and because in that choosing she found an answer to the long, tired question that had haunted her, whether she wanted to be part of his life even when it was hard. Outside, the house held its breath. Inside, two people chose each other in 1,000 small acts rather than one grand one. The path ahead would remain strewn with ghosts and gossip and tests, but for the first time in a long while, Era's heart had found an echo in Zion's chest. And yet, because stories like theirs are not without their cliffs and sharp turns, the very next morning would bring something that neither of them expected, a letter, pressed by the assistant's careful hand upon the mahogany desk, with a name on it neither wanted to see. It would be a ripple that promises to become a wave. The morning light came thin through the blinds, painting the study in stripes of gold and grey. Zion found the envelope on his desk like a summons, cream, edged in old-fashioned handwriting, the sort of paper that remembered hands. No postmark. No courier stamp. Just his name in a looping script he had not seen in years. To Zion, "Open when you are ready." For a moment he simply stared. The house felt very large around him, as if the rooms themselves waited to see what he would do. He turned the envelope in his hands. It smelled faintly of jasmine and something older, the kind of scent that memory wore like a shawl. He could have left it. He could have folded it back into the drawer where a dozen other things stayed hidden. But whatever courage he'd been collecting since Era left had settled into his bones. He slid a finger under the flap and opened it. The paper inside was Mahira's handwriting, the same slant he recognized from tucked notes and pages. His throat tightened before he read a single word. Her letters were small and direct, wrapped in a warmth he had not allowed himself to remember. "Zion," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have gone ahead. I imagine you will be angry at me for writing things down, but I wanted to say what I could not say with fear of being selfish. If there is a moment when life asks you to choose between remembering me and living, choose living. Marry if you must. Laugh. Make a home that has voices around the table. Do not bury yourself in grief and call it loyalty. If you ever love again, let it be loud and honest. If she is kind, let her be kind to you. I will not come between your future. I promise you, from wherever I go, I will wish you well." The line he had read made the room tilt. A part of him had always imagined Mahira's memory as a stern thing with expectations, a gatekeeper of loyalty. But here she was, in ink and paper, giving him permission to be alive. Tears he had kept stalemated under years of restraint prickled hot and sudden. He read on. "If you are with her, be gentle. She will carry shards you do not see. Love her by letting her see you. That is the only way to be faithful to everyone who has loved you. M." For the first time since that hard day that had carved his life, something loosened in Zion. It was not a flood. Grief doesn't evaporate in a single afternoon, but a small, honest light began to move down the dry corridors of his heart. Mahira's voice on the paper was not an accusation, it was a benediction. He folded the letter against his chest like a man holding a fragile bird. The world outside the study was busy and loud, but inside, in that hush, Zion felt the shape of a decision forming. He wanted to go to Era, to take her into his arms and tell her the whole truth, that he had been bound by the past and that somebody he had loved had told him to live. He wanted to say, "I have been a coward. I will try now." The words rose in his mouth like a confession rehearsed at last. Before he could rise, the study door opened and Mrs. Farrar drifted in like a storm wearing pearls. Her eyes slid to the letter on his desk with hawk-like interest. "What is that?" she asked flatly. Zion closed his palm over the envelope instinctively. "Nothing for you to concern yourself with," he said, but his voice lacked its usual steel. Mrs. Farrar moved in a few long-legged steps and seized the paper. "Mahira's handwriting," she murmured, more to herself than to him. A twisted little smile tugged at her mouth. "Why did no one tell me there were more letters? Why all this secrecy?" Zion's stomach hollowed. "It was kept private," he said. "Private?" She scoffed. "In our family nothing is private when it concerns the name. Who gave you permission to?" "You will not speak of this," Zion said before he could think. The sound surprised them both. It was low, commanding in the way it used to be when he protected what he did not want the world to ransack. Mrs. Farrar's lips thinned. "You have been very sentimental lately, nephew. First the flowers, now letters. People will talk. Do you want the papers and the board to know the kind of man who keeps a shrine? We have a legacy to protect." Zion's fingers tightened on the envelope. He could feel how far society's rusted claws reached into the private, the way reputations fed gossip that ate whole people alive. He thought of Era, sitting alone in a room he occupied but never warmed. He thought of Mahira's words, "Choose living." He made a choice in that breath. "This is personal," he said evenly. "It stays with me." Mrs. Farrar peered at him as if he had lost his sense. "You will do as I say. Open this in a proper time. Not tonight, not when strangers can make it into a scandal." Her tone was serpentine, venom wrapped in a velvet glove. Zion felt a cold knot of anger at her interference. It was not only about the letter, it was about the way she measured him with someone else's rulebook. He placed the envelope in his inner drawer and closed it like closing a wound. "I will decide," he said. "Not you." She left with a muttered threat that would bloom later, and Zion stood alone with paper that smelled of jasmine and with the feeling that for the first time someone from the past had eased her hand upon his chest and told him to breathe. He wanted to find Era. He wanted to tell her Mahira had blessed him to be human again. He wanted to let her know that the apology had proof behind it. But Mrs. Farrar's warning had a weight. There were eyes in every room, and Mrs. Farrar's sharpness had a way of turning small things into weapons. If the family believed Zion's heart unmoored, the gossip would not only shame him, it might be used to unravel the fragile beginnings between him and Era. He hesitated, and that hesitation was noticed. Era, in the other wing of the house, was watering her marigolds, hands gentle, sleeves rolled. She felt something like the premonition of bad weather in her chest but couldn't name it. She had learned to watch for Zion's footsteps in the hall. When they did not come, she did not assume the worst. But the house held whispers like sticks of burning incense, scents that clung. That afternoon, she discovered the small silvered bracelet Zion had given her in the study drawer when she was dropping off a book. She held it like a small treasure, fingers tracing its cool curve. For a moment, hope pricked bright and dangerous. Perhaps he had been thinking of her, leaving small things like breadcrumbs back to a path. Instead, when she wore it, she felt him withdraw. He moved through the day preoccupied, thin with tension. He spoke less, and when he did, there was something tight in the way he arranged his words. She watched him carefully, her heart cataloguing the shifts like a weatherwoman noting the sky. When the evening came, Zion stayed late in the study, longer than usual. The lamps threw long shadows. Mrs. Farrar came and went, her movements like a net being cast, checking corners. Era, who had finished her evening chores, found herself standing at the study door, remembering the letter she had once seen tucked away months before. Curiosity and that old, tender hope made her step forward. She pushed the door open without knocking just a fraction. She did not see Zion at the desk, she saw Mrs. Farrar's silhouette moving like a dark bird. The envelope, the same cream she had imagined, lay open between them. Era's breath caught. Before she could retreat, Mrs. Farrar's voice, soft but sharp as a blade, slipped through the room, so he kept her last words hidden. Typical. He can love in public and grieve in secret. Era's vision blurred. She stepped fully inside then, so fully that the silence snapped like a thread. Zion turned at the sound of her steps, his eyes full of a guilt that had nothing to do with betrayal and everything to do with fear of losing her again. "What is this?" Era asked, voice barely steady. She looked at the open letter, the handwriting she now recognized, the name that made her chest ache, Mahira. Zion's hand closed over the paper as if it could shield her from a memory that felt like a rival. Mrs. Farah leaned forward, her voice lowered but lethal. "It's a letter from the late Mrs. Malik. She wrote to him before she died. He kept it hidden, and now he reads it when it suits his conscience. How romantic for the household." Era felt the color drain. She had imagined dozens of scenes, confessions, small kindnesses, maybe even a private apology, but nothing like this, the letter used as proof of divided loyalties, baptized in gossip. Zion moved to her side, his voice rough. "Era, please, it is not what you think." She looked at him, and in that look was every night she had waited, every time she had stood in a doorway waiting for him to say her name as more than a syllable. "Then tell me," she said. "Tell me now before someone else makes the story for you." He opened his mouth, closed it, and then, because Mahira's ink seemed to give him courage, he placed the letter in Era's hands. "Read it," he said. "Read what she wanted for me." Her fingers shook as she unfolded the paper. The lines she read were the ones Zion had read earlier, Mahira's blessing, her permission to live. The words were gentle, unburdening. Era's eyes softened as she traced the ink. After the initial sting, something in her loosened. Mahira had not been an accusation, she had been an ally in ink. Mrs. Farah, watching the change, leaned back as if defeated for the moment. But she was not a woman to be so easily quieted. "Letters don't change facts," she said coldly. "A man who reads comfort and then acts must answer to the family. Will you allow him to give away that dignity for sentiment?" Era looked at Zion then, at the man whose face had been a fortress for 3 years, and for one trembling morning a brittle gate. "You should have told me," she said simply. "Not because of society, not because of gossip, because I deserve to know the truth of the man to whom I gave my life." Zion's throat moved. "I was afraid to hurt you with the past. I thought shielding you would spare you pain." She placed the letter back on the desk. "Pain shared becomes less sharp," she said. "Pain hidden becomes a weapon." Mrs. Farah's eyes flashed. She stepped forward as if to snatch the letter away, but Zion drew back his hand like a man protecting something fragile. The room trembled with the threat of what could happen if she took control. Outside, a car horn blared. The day moved on, but inside, the small paper had tipped a scale. There would be gossip. There would be whispers. Mrs. Farah would not stop until the whole household knew the drama, and the household would turn into a jury. Era felt something resolve in her then, not a decision born of mercy, but of self-preservation. "If Mrs. Farah uses this to judge me, she will find that I do not play to her script," she said, voice steady. "Zion, you have to decide, will you let your past be a reason to punish me, or will you let it be a reason to be honest, with me and with everyone?" Zion's eyes filled. For once his answer did not hide behind fear or shame. He stepped toward her and took her hand without hesitation. "I choose truth," he said. "I choose you." Mrs. Farah watched them, calculating, her lips a thin line. She would not give up. She had storms of her own to direct. For her, reputation was a currency. For them, it was a test. As the three stood in that small circle of light, something heavy shifted. The letter had done what letters often do. It forced secrets into daylight and demanded choices. Zion had to choose between the past and the living hand in his. But the house is never without witnesses. A distant maid had seen Mrs. Farah leave, and she had seen Era stand in the doorway. People talk. Stories warp in retelling. The next morning a whisper would be in the ears of more than just family members. And rumors, once started, grow teeth. Era moved away then, not in defeat but in guard. She needed time, room to think, to let Mahira's words land, to see if Zion would really change. He had chosen truth, he had said, but words needed the ballast of action. Zion watched her go, the letter clutched in his fist. He thought of Mahira's last line, "If she is kind, let her be kind to you," and realized the full weight of that kindness. He had been given a gift, Not the release from memory but the invitation to be brave. Outside, the city continued its noise. Inside, in the rooms that had learned silence like a habit, two people began the slow work of turning confession into a practice. But because life is rarely content to wait while hearts arrange themselves, the shadow of Mrs. Farrar's gossip was already stretching to touch corners of the house that had not yet learned to be brave. That night, as Era sat in her room writing in her diary, she left the envelope unopened and faced the truth that whispered like a storm. Love is not merely what you are given, it is what you both decide to keep alive. Together or apart, the house had started to taste like secrets. After the letter incident, whispers braided themselves through the servants' rooms and into drawing rooms where polite faces never met honest eyes. Mrs. Farrar's barbs traveled faster than she could imagine. Gossip, once released, spread like spilled ink, impossible to gather up again. Era moved through her days with a fragile new armor. Mahira's letter had changed something, not because it absolved the past, but because it made the truth visible. She could see Zion's grief with fresh clarity, and that clarity created a new ache. She wanted to stand beside him and not behind him. Yet even as her compassion grew, so did an unease that would not be soothed by kindness alone. How do you build a life beside someone whose heart keeps midnight appointments with the dead? The next week folded into itself with small experiments, Zion leaving earlier, returning later, Mrs. Farrar watching their interactions like a judge taking notes, Era trying to offer ordinary warmth that was never ostentatious, only persistent. Sometimes Zion met her halfway, sometimes he retreated. The tension was no longer only inside Zion, it lived between them, waiting like a thing that might either break or bind them together. One evening Era found a handkerchief on the garden path. It was embroidered with initials she recognized, his, and it smelled faintly of the lilies she had once placed in his car. She picked it up, puzzled. It looked as if it had been dropped hastily, as if someone had been there and left in a rush. She held it to her face and, for the first time, wondered not in the abstract but with a steady, searching aim. Where did he go when he left the house? Why did he vanish some nights without a word? The handkerchief felt like a map with a missing direction. That night, the questions ate at her like a persistent insect. She did what she had vowed not to do, she followed. It was not brave, it was frightened. She wrapped herself simply, took the smallest bag, and slipped into a taxi whose driver seemed indifferent to destinations. Her heart thudded with the rhythm of someone walking a tightrope. If she found evidence of betrayal, would she storm back and dismantle the life she had tried so patiently to grow? Or would she find something else, a reason to stay, or to leave? The drive took them out of the city, past well-lit storefronts and then into a quieter stretch where the highway curved and trees kept their own counsel. On the edge of town, the taxi slowed near a path that led to a small, older cemetery, not the manic row of polished stones in the newer sections, but a cluster of graves hemmed by cypress and wild roses. The air here held a different volume, privacy thick as velvet. She watched, heart pinpricked, as a car slowed and a man stepped out. He was familiar in silhouette and different in stance, shoulders turned not to command but to carry something. Zion. He held a bouquet of white lilies close to his chest like a talisman. He walked slowly, each step deliberate. Era slipped from the taxi like a ghost who hoped not to be seen. She crept among hedgerows while stamped dirt gave way under her shoes. The garden lights cast long, solemn shadows. When she reached the path, she paused behind a leaning yew and let the sight find her without intervention. Zion stopped before a grave. The stone was modest, a woman's name carved into its face with a small inscription beneath it. Even from a distance, she could read the letters, could feel the weight that lay under them. Mahira Khan Malik. The same name that had been ink on paper, now cold and fixed in stone. He knelt as if gravity had a new law at that spot, and placed the lilies with hands that trembled though he tried to make them steady. He rested his forehead near the stone and spoke in a voice almost too low to hear, a reverent murmur that seemed to be a private ritual. Mahira, he whispered, and the syllable broke like a fragile thing. They put new things into my days. There is a woman in my house now. She does not know the depth of what you were to me. I do not want to betray you, and yet I am afraid to love her the way she deserves. Era felt the world contract around that sentence. The grief in his voice was not theatrical but carved from long nights. He folded himself smaller and as he did, she understood how true Mahira's letter had been. It had not demanded his forgetfulness, it had asked him to live. And he seemed to be trying, painfully, awkwardly, in fits and starts, to follow that instruction. He sat back on his heels and continued, his lips barely moving, as if memorizing each word once more. I read your letter today, he confessed to the stone, the lilies bright against the grey. You told me to live. I have been a coward, Mahira. I thought by keeping you close in silence I honored you. But maybe respect is not prison. Maybe you wanted me breathing. Era's throat tightened until she could not tell whether she was breathing or not. The sight of him so raw, so unguarded, hit her harder than any accusation could have. She had expected hatred, or a scene, or the cold arrogance of a man ashamed to be seen. Instead she had stumbled upon a man in the act of learning how to be human again. He rose slowly, fingers trailing over the inscription as if blessing it. He pressed his palm briefly against the stone, then turned to the shadows where Era crouched. For the first heartbeat it seemed as if he might look up. For the first time since she had followed him, she almost dared to hope he would see her and be glad. Instead, he folded himself away from the grave and walked back toward his car without looking left or right. Era remained hidden until his taillights disappeared into the night. The cold of the stone and the hush of the cemetery settled into her bones like winter. She did not move for a long time. The lilies lay where he had left them, faces turned toward a sky that felt unfairly bright. When she reached home, the mansion looked like a house that had been waiting for her to return. The staff slept or pretended to. The echo of her footsteps was loudly private. She carried the handkerchief she had found earlier and pressed it to her lips as though to taste the memory it contained. In the solitude of her room, she let the tears come, not of anger at a woman who had been taken away by fate, but of grief for a man who loved someone he could not fetch back, for the small ridiculous hope she had had that grief could be shared rather than impersonated as loyalty. That night 100 questions sat between them like ghost chairs at a table. She thought of confronting him, of shouting, of demanding he explain why his heart kept a separate altar. She thought of Mrs. Farah twisting the story into village gossip. She thought, too, of Mahira's voice on paper telling him to live. It all collided and blurred into one hard truth. Love, in this house, would be complicated in ways that headlines could not hold. Era did not decide then. She made no dramatic exit. She did not confront him at midnight or fling the doors wide to the servants. Instead she lay awake, the moon like a coin outside her window, and wrote a single line in her diary. He loves someone he cannot touch, and he also continues to hurt me by staying bound. Which wound do I choose to mend? The night wore on. Zion would come home at the edges of dawn, exhausted and careful. He would find her awake, perhaps, and they would both have to find words that would not annihilate the fragile progress made in the past weeks. There would be talk with Kareem Chacha, sharp days of family meddling, and the slow unspooling of truth that has to be chosen into being rather than forced. Outside the mansion, the city began to awake. Inside, two people who had begun to learn the language of each other's hearts now faced a new dialect of sorrow, not merely the past and the present but the question of whether a living love could be claimed when so many nights were already claimed by memory. Era closed her diary and pressed the pen flat in the middle of the page. In the hush she heard the clock in the hall declare a single small hour. She folded the handkerchief and placed it where she could touch it in the dark. She did not yet know if she would forgive him in the way that mends or in the way that rotates into acceptance. She only knew one thing with a frightened clarity. She had seen him as he was when no one else watched, and that sight would change everything between them. The house hummed with ordinary noises, silverware, muffled television, a distant car engine, but in Era's chest there was a different kind of sound, the steady tightening of a rope being pulled. It had been a long time since she felt something that demanded action rather than patience. Seeing Zion at the grave, hearing him speak to stone with a tenderness she could not share, reading Mahira's words and realizing she had been offered the compassion of a ghost, all of it had rearranged the furniture of her heart. That night she sat on her bed with a small suitcase open at her feet.